think we are recording. Somebody read Genesis chapter 11, verse 26 through 32.
(26 through 32). Cornelius, were you about to read? Go ahead. All right.
What is it?
Genesis chapter 11, 26 through 32.
Okay, give me 1 second. (26). Yeah, 26, correct?
Yes, 26 through 32.
26 through 32, yes.
Okay. 1 second. Still waiting. It's almost up here. Okay.
Let me show you.
All right, here we go. After Terah had lived 70 years, he became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. This is the count of Terah's family line. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran became the father of Lot. While this father of Terah was still alive, Haran died in Ur of the Chaldeans in the land of his birth. Abraham and Nahor are both married. The name of Abram's wife was Sarah, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. She was the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. Sarah was childless because she was not able to conceive. Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarah, the wife of his son Abram, and together they set out from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there.
Verse 32.
That's it. Okay. 32? Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. Terah lived 205 years, and he died in Haran.
All right, excellent. All right, so at some point, they spent a lot of time in Haran. We don't know exactly how long, but he settled in Haran. They spent a lot of time. But we want to go back and remind ourselves of some takeaways that we learned last week about this story. What were some of the things that stood out to you guys from remembrance? And I'll kind of add and connect the dots.
Well, one of the things we talked about, that Sarah was also, I think, if that's how you pronounce that name?
Yes.
We had discussed that. Wait, okay. Okay.
Come on, John.
I believe you mentioned.
He'll be in and out.
Okay. I believe you mentioned Abram took Lot because his intention was maybe to make Lot his heir since Sarah was barren.
Yeah. We talked about that. Everything kind of points in that also to honor his dead brother, right? So, it was a vow that Abram was keeping to care for his dead brother's children. So that's part of it as well, so yeah. All right, anybody else? Anything else? I think Will was getting to the fact about Sarah. What did we learn about Sarai last in Ishka?
We discussed that they was the same person,
Yes, yes.
right?
Most likely Sarai and Ishka is the same person. Ishka is the Chaldean, version of Sarai. And again, we have to think about writing narratives. This particular Genesis narrative was written down during the time of exile. So those generational stories, oral accounts passed down orally for generation after generation, was finally written down. And so writing them down, you in one way you write down to try to connect the culture or the people group, and then the next one you kind of point and direct some familiarity from within your culture. So that's kind of what we see happening in Ishka and Sarah, both means princess. All right. So means princess. All right. Anything else we discussed or uncovered?
Something that I've was contemplating, it said that Terah took Abram, his grandson, and Sarah, and they left Ur of the Chaldees. Well, and then later in verse, and in verse 12, it said that the Lord told Abram to get up and leave his country. So Terah, they'd already left Ur of the Chaldees and gone on their way to Canaan. So for some reason, until I really got into reading that, I thought that so he didn't really tell Abraham to leave Ur of the Chaldees. He just told him to leave. Where was he telling him to leave from?
From to leave his father's household. Let's look at it and see. Verse 12. All right. Somebody read verse 1.
You're talking about chapter 12, right?
I'm sorry. Yeah, chapter 12. Sorry. Chapter 12,
Okay.
verse 1.
Okay. Okay. Do you have it up there? So I got my glasses on. Now, the Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from your country." You made it go away, can you say? Go from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to a land which I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great. And so so you shall be a blessing. Okay, let me see 3. And I will bless those who bless you, and the ones who curse you, I will curse. You all the families of the earth shall be blessed.
Yeah. And that's
Okay.
one of why we're chasing this out, because we're trying to find our connection. How are we connected? That verse connects us to this story at some point. All right. However, and it connects us to God's purpose or God's story. So as we talk about the gospel is the good news of God. All right. The good news, not just the good news of God's Son, but it's the good news. It didn't abbreviate it to God's Son only. And this is the story of God. And we want to understand how we fit in God's story. That's important to us. That's important for us. We should know how we fit in God's story and God's plan. All right. Now, let's go back to verse 1. Read that one more time.
Okay. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you."
All right. And
Okay.
so here, John asked the question or referred to the statement, God told Abram to leave. What did he tell him to leave away from? Here's John.
Well, according to this, he was already apparently was telling him to leave his father's household, which was had moved from Ur of the Chaldees to Haran. So apparently he's telling him to get up and leave Haran and go where they hadn't quite made it to Canaan. Haran's not in Canaan, I don't believe. I'll need to look at my atlas, but
It's not. It's not. It's not.
Okay.
What?
So Terah never made it to Canaan. He was on his way, and then they stayed in Haran, and then that's where Terah died.
Yes. He never made it. But we see that it's we don't know the reason God spoke to Terah as well in some way. Someone told Terah in his mind, he made it up in his heart that he would set out and take his family to settle in Canaan. So it's no coincidence. So God spoke to him in some way as well. However, God didn't fulfill his promise through Terah for whatever reason. And Terah never made it to the place he desired or set out in his heart to go. It could have been a lot of things. We know in the midst of that, Terah's son Haran died. And on his way to Canaan, he passes through a land called Haran. So maybe in his agony and in his loss of his son, one or two things happened. He went to a land and it just so happened to be the same name, or the place called the same name he named his son, or the writers changed the name of the place Haran because he and his family settled there. And as I mentioned earlier, they stayed there for about 100+ years. If you look at the age, when they started talking about Terah, he was about 76 years old when he had sons and daughters. And then when he died, he was 200 and something years old. So he stayed in Haran for a long time. And it could have been throughout that particular time and that particular age that eventually someone changed the name of that place, or they allowed him to name the place. All right. So one or two things would happen. However, he never fulfilled the desire to make it to Canaan. Then here comes Abram, and God speaks to him and tells him to go from his country. At that time, it's Haran. They from Chaldea. They had him and his father had already left Chaldea, and they settled in Haran. And they're there. If I'm somewhere for 50 years, that's my country. That's my country. So we see that they lived there for quite some time. All right. And then he tells them to leave his relatives and his father's household. All right. So that's a big ask in that culture. It seems small to us, but in this particular day, in that culture, that's a big ask. Any other thoughts? All right.
Well, you say it seems small, but to me, even if somebody was to ask me to leave Western and move to Memphis, it'll be a big move on my behalf, right?
Yeah.
Because I've been here for a while. So this is once again showing you the faith that Abraham Abraham did have and trust God, because he didn't even hesitate, because that's a big move. And then it told him, and also to leave your family too.
Yeah.
Because if somebody would say, hey, we'll move to Memphis and leave your family and everybody and come to Memphis. Boy, that'd be a big move. How would you feel leaving Memphis and coming to Western, Houston? You know what I mean? Hello?
Yeah, it's a big ask.
Yeah, so go ahead. Abraham has strong, man. I don't think we know the the faith that Abraham had to have in God, right, to make this big move.
Yeah, well, then too, all right, so at this point, there's no nation of Israel, there's no Jew, there's no Abram was a he was a Gentile just like we are.
Okay, yeah,
And Terah, because you know they were and they were not you know, they were polytheists. They believed in other gods other than the God of Israel. You know, instead of one God, they believed in, you know, several gods. So I guess that's all got to be playing into some way, because he called a man out of polytheism, out of the who was a Gentile, basically Abram, and Abram had the faith to follow him, and of course God promised him he would make a great nation of him. And at what point did they become? I guess they became the nation of Israel. When did they become the nation of Israel, Casey? That was prior to them going into Egypt, correct? I mean, was it?
Nah. You know, I think they became the nation of Israel when Jacob, after Jacob, because see, there wasn't no nation of Israel. There was no until Jacob wrestled with God. Right. And then God
okay. Oh, you're right. That's when he changed his name to Israel.
Changed his name to Israel.
Yeah. Okay.
And remember, Abraham became the first Hebrew.
Yeah.
The first mission of Hebrews when Abraham became a Hebrew.
Yeah. And what we don't account the waiting period or the amount of time it took or the amount of time it would take to see God fulfill his promise, meaning to make him into a great nation. Abraham would never see that happen in his lifetime. You know, although he lived to be 100 and something years old, he still would not live long enough to see himself become a great nation. So he walked into the promises and trusted God's promise. He walked as if he was a great nation from that day forward. He had to outweigh his agony of his wife being barren. He had to outweigh the upbringing of a child at 100 years old. You know, it was a lot of things. And so he knew that he had to invest all of himself in his son Isaac in fulfilling or accomplishing the promise of God. Therefore, we see Isaac, and we'll read, come on the scene. And we see everything his father invested into him. Isaac, you know, held dear to his heart, and God reminded Isaac of those promises, and he invested those promises into his children, Esau and Jacob. But we see Jacob, in some sense, value those promises, and we see Esau maybe not have it, be gracious to Esau, maybe not have as much value in those promises. And how do you know that, Keusi? Because Jacob was after the birthright. Because Jacob valued the birthright, he valued the promises of God that his father taught him about. And he knew that through those promises, it would be fulfilled through the birthright. So it was something more about Jacob that we didn't even give Jacob credit for, but there was something about Esau that he didn't necessarily value it. So no wonder God chose to fulfill his promise through Jacob, because God can't fulfill promises through somebody who's in disbelief. That's a lesson for us all. When we're sitting around struggling and doubting, it's impossible for God to fulfill his promises through someone who's struggling in disbelief. We have to be firmly convinced. We have to live out what we're convinced of with our life, and our lifestyle has to align. Come on, Will.
Oh, I'm just coming back from, you know what I'm doing, right?
Okay. I know. I thought you unmuted. come back with a comment.
No, no.
I'd like to, okay, I'm just trying to sort this out. Okay, so we have Abraham, and he is he's a Gentile, but he has faith, and God counted it unto him as righteousness. But see, the sign of the covenant was circumcision. That was, when Abraham went into a deep sleep and he saw, he laid those, he cut those sacrifices in two and kept the birds off of them. And then he went into a deep sleep and he saw the fiery furnace coming between them, which was God, making the covenant. And then at that point, Abraham had to be circumcised, but I guess it wasn't until, he walked a long ways with Abraham, or Abraham walked with God for a long time, and then to Isaac, because the one of the things that makes the Jews very unique are the signs that God gave them that are not applicable to us as Gentiles. For example, we're not held by the dietary laws and even circumcision for that matter. But all that was kind of progressive, wasn't it, Casey? I mean, like Abraham didn't get circumcised and change all his eating habits, I guess is what I'm trying to say. That came later on. I'm just trying to get the progression. It just didn't happen, boom. It happened through each generation. Isaac and the whole Israel thing kind of started with Jacob, when he wrestled and, an angel of the Lord said, you'll now be Israel. Am I following that correctly?
Yeah. And like you mentioned, it's a progression. Trying to see it all together at one time will overwhelm anybody. So that's why we're taking our time to kind of watch it unfold, scene by scene, setting by setting, generation by generation.
Well, I like the step-by-step approach. It really brings the culture into great focus. We skim over so much because in our Baptist upbringing or Presbyterian or whatever we are, we've spiritualized so many things that we forget that, man, this is where it all started. I mean, that's 2,000 years before Calvin came on the scene, and it's yeah. So thanks for taking us slowly through this. I mean, it really makes me ponder things I've never pondered, and this is very, very important. I've never looked at this as how important it really is in the while we're sitting here today is and we're not part of the Jewish nation. We're Gentiles that were grafted into the vine, so to speak.
Yeah. So and even what you said, John, most Christians don't have a reference point for Calvinism and all of those Reformation. It's not widely known, and that confuses people. So that's why we're taking this approach as well, so we can kind of see it unfold, from the lens God painted it through, without those names, because God didn't ordain or place any of those terms or names in His story. Matter of fact, those names may distort the story more than clarifying it. So we will remove those terms and stuff from our narrative that we learn. That way we can see it from God's perspective. So yeah.
KUC, we were talking about Abraham, but we were talking about the law. But John, you were talking about the law. But the law didn't come for over 400 some years after Abraham. Right? Abraham, they didn't have no law. Abraham didn't receive what he got because he kept a law. Abraham believed in God.
Right.
And it was the promises, right? And the promises being fulfilled in us today.
Yep.
When we keep saying calling ourselves Gentile, right? That sounds good, But when you look all the way down through the history of this book, we realize that it is all, the promises is all fulfilled in Christ. Then but that's way down the road. Like you say, because in Christ there is no Gentile.
Well, I'm
There
not
is
sure.
no Jew.
In Zechariah, it says that in the when in the kingdom of God, we're going to be, I'm not talking about the like when Christ comes back for the 1,000 years, it said that the Gentiles will be hanging on to the coattails of the Jews, saying, let me follow you to the mountain of the Lord. I mean, so these are just all things that I don't mean to be getting deep because I don't really know all I'm talking about, but I'm just telling you, there's a lot of things that I used to believe about the spiritualization of the whole, that spiritual, that we're spiritual Israel and all that kind of stuff. I've started to think a little differently, but I'm going to leave that to my pastor. That's why I follow him.
Okay. Well, let's any other thoughts? Let's go back to the story. All right, so we can kind of see where we are. Let's point out a couple of things, right? That's going to help us focus, or let's ask a question. Let's focus on, first of all, what did Abraham give up? Let's think about that. We'll spend maybe the rest of our time today, or somewhere. Abraham, we know God called Abraham from his father's household, and we know God made promises to Abraham to make him into a great nation. We know God promised to bless the world through Abraham. All the nations of the earth will be blessed because of him and through him. All right. So our connection to God begins with Abraham. That's what we all have to understand. Matter of fact, if you go into the Middle East, you take all those Eastern Muslims, Jews, the Israelis, Pakistans, Palestinians, Arabians, all of those individuals will say Abraham is our father. All right. All of those individuals will say Abraham is our father, yet there's so much conflict between all of those individuals today. All right. So God fulfilled his promise to say, you know what, even Christians, our claim is that, we felt like God sent Jesus Christ to take ownership of the Bible away from the Jews because they executed Jesus and give it back to the Christians. That's the way some people believe and think. All right. That's not true, right? But we're all fighting for our connection with Abraham, because through Abraham we have a connection with God. And God, so there was something special about Abraham. So the next question is, so one is, what did Abraham give up? Please write these questions down. The next one is, what was so special about Abraham? What was so special about Abraham? I'm not going to ask the question, why did God choose Abraham anymore? I just want to ask, what was so special about Abraham? So 2 questions. What did Abraham give up? And what was so special about Abraham? All right. But because last week we concluded that, God chose Abraham, but we started to see some evidence into Abraham's character that's not obvious. And the story writers or the scribes of the Bible didn't highlight those character traits. They exemplified them, meaning we have to pay attention to cause and effect. Meaning we see an issue, we have to see the effect, or we see an issue, we have to understand the cause of it. And we have to observe Abraham's responses. And we have to ask ourselves, what character trait causes someone to respond that way? All right. Because character is built around the way we respond to life. That's what identifies someone's character. The actions that they take from the circumstances that they're around or exposed to reveals character. All right. Character is not expressed in words, but action. So Abraham had something. So let's look here. What did Abraham give up? Let's start there. What do we think? And we're going to have to use chapter 11 to help us answer this question because we got to go back and see where he came from. Anybody, what did Abraham give up?
I think he gave up everything.
One
Family.
moment.
He gave up the beta of his father's house. I mean, it'd be like you being the heir to a fortune, and then you're just walking away from it, and or it didn't even have to be a fortune, but he just walked away from everything society had ever told him up to that point.
Yeah, let me be fair. All right. Let me put some boundaries and some guides and some rules to the responses. I want everybody to repeat what you said eventually in order, one by one. But we have to use context. So from your response, where do you see it? Show us. You have to show us. I want you to respond. I want you to tell us. We want to have this conversation, but we have to see it too. So show us where your responses are visible in scripture. Where are you getting your response from? Come on, Dr. Fred.
In Genesis chapter 12, now the Lord said to Abram, go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house. So Abraham gave up his family, he gave up his heritage, and he gave up his country.
All right. Let me go back through. One more time. Give me 1 second. All right. So he gave up. Now go through your list one more time.
He gave up his country. He gave up his family.
Country.
And I said, and heritage.
Yeah, heritage. All right. Okay. All right. Anybody? There's anything else from you?
That's all for me.
All right. All right. Anybody else?
Well, that's pretty much summed it up. And my answer, he gave up everything. That he didn't leave. I mean, like what you just said in the scripture, Dr. Fred. He gave up everything, and left.
Okay. All right. So he gave up everything and left. All right. Come on, John. You had something.
Dr. Fred kind of stole my thunder. Thank you, Fred.
All right. Let's go back to come on, Dr. Fred.
I guess what you're saying, teacher, is we want to unpack that everything, right? We're trying to unpack that, right? What does that look like? Break that down, right?
Yeah. So and again, I just wanted to hear context. So we'll confer with you that his everything means country, family, heritage from Will's perspective is everything. That's what I get out of that.
Yeah.
All right. And John was kind of say some of those things, but one of the two. So we're gonna look at that country, family, and heritage, and we got to understand what does that mean. Like what country did he give up? Let's go back to verse 11. Chapter 11. All right. Now we got to read and pay attention to verse 26. See something. Genealogy first to see where it could identify a location. All right, for fun, let's start at verse 10. All right, let's read through these descendants. All right. Now these are Shem's descendants. So this is one of Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So this is Shem. All right. All right. Shem and Japheth were honored by Noah. You got to remember that. All right. Shem and Japheth were honored by Noah because there was a time when Noah was uncovered. And Ham saw him but did nothing. And he went and told his brother. There's conversation around that or tradition or legend, whether or not he went and made fun of his father or whatever. But he did nothing. But however, when he told Shem and Japheth, Shem says, you know what? And the story shows us that Shem was the father of the idea to cover his father's nakedness. He was also the father of the idea that we're not going to look at our father like Ham did. We're going to walk in backwards and cover him up. Because that way we can give our father enough grace, dignity, and respect not to look at it uncovered naked. And so the Bible shows that Shem is the author of the idea. And because of that, God honors him through the text. And he shows us that Noah honored him. Is because they begin to put his name first, and then something happens with his genealogy. That God does. The reason why I say God honored him, because God does something with his genealogy that he didn't do with Japheth's genealogy, nor did he do with Ham's genealogy in the Bible. And that means he didn't trace it out. It was traced out in their culture because that's what they did. They kept up with the genealogy because that heritage was important. Family legacy was vitally important. Matter of fact, it was the most important thing. It was so important that the children of the father had no identity of their own. Everybody's identity lied and rested in the father's identity. And everything you did, your value and your worth was to contribute to the father's legacy. That was the purpose of your birth. But that means when a father had a child brought into the world, it was to extend the father's legacy and wealth. But that was okay in our culture. That's an oxymoron in our culture today, right? And everything the father did, the household adhered to it. If the father changed his living, the household changes living. If the father changes religion, the household changes religion. And that's what we see happen. So we got to remember that as we watch it, we got to understand what's happening. Like everything in this culture is breathed and lived through the father. So tracing out the legacy of the father is vitally important. And we see that happening. So let's look at the records of Shem. Somebody start at verse 10 in chapter 11.
These are the records of the grand generations of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and became the father of Arpachshad 2 years after the flood. And Shem lived 500 years after he became the father of Arpachshad. And he had other sons and daughters. And Arpachshad lived 35 years and became the father of Shelah. And Arpachshad lived 403 years after he became the father of Shelah, and he had other sons and daughters. Keep going.
I want us to pay attention to how they identify the age of the father. They give his age at the birth of his firstborn. Then they give the age of the number of years he lived after the firstborn. And so we add the number of years he lived after the firstborn with the age he was when he had his firstborn, and we get his total age. So we want to pay attention to that. That's a cadence that we see, constantly. It's the same cadence. We give the age of the father at the birth of his firstborn, and then it gives the number of years that he lived after the firstborn. So we want to look at that. Will it be important? Maybe, maybe not. All right. Let's pay attention. All right. Somebody else start at verse 14. We'll save some pain so everybody won't have to. Everybody can share in the stumbling over these words.
All right, when Shalom had lived 30 years, he fathered Abram. And Shalom lived after fathering Abram 403 years and had other sons and daughters.
So
And Abram, okay, go ahead.
We see the cadence. We see his age at the birth of his firstborn.
So would that be 30?
Yep, 30.
And then so he lived 403 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
And not when they say 403 years, that means he was having kids all the rest of that time, right?
Well, not necessarily all of that time, but he had more children during that time.
Okay, then.
Yeah. Yeah. We don't know at what point he cut off. It doesn't say, but we do know he began to have children at the age of 30. And during that time, it says he had other sons and daughters, but it gives us his entire length of life after so what I'm saying is this is showing us how significant the firstborn is. This is where we get the concept of the birthright. All right. So this was something that was established prior to Abram or Abraham, but we see how important it has always been as we read through these genealogies. All right. So, yeah, they highlight the firstborn son. All right, let's keep going.
14. When Shalom had lived 30 years, I just read that, and father Abram, and Shalom lived after he had fathered Abram 403 years and had other sons and daughters. And Abram had lived 34 years, and he fathered Peleg. And Abram lived after he fathered Peleg 430 years, and he had other sons and daughters. And Peleg had lived 30 years, and he fathered Ruth. And Peleg lived after he fathered Ruth 209 years and had other sons and daughters. Wow. And when Ruth had lived 32 years, he fathered Sarah. And then when Ruth lived after he fathered Sarah 200 years, he had other sons and daughters. Okay, when I don't know how to pronounce this word, when Sarah had lived 30 years, he fathered Nahor. And Sarah lived after he fathered Nahor 200 years and had other sons and daughters. And when Nahor lived 29 years, he fathered Terah. And Nahor lived after he fathered Terah 119 years, and he had other sons and daughters. And when Terah had lived 70 years, he fathered Abraham, Nahor, and Haran.
All right, let's pause for a moment. What do we notice about the father? I'll try to get us closer to the answer. What do we notice about the father's age when they
started at 30?
Somewhere around the age of 30, yes. Just becomes important because of what we know about the age of 30 in the Jewish culture, right? So don't have any other observation except for I don't believe in coincidence, right? So, but at the age of 30, around the age of 30, we see whether it's 31, 32, 30, 29, right around that age, we see the firstborn coming into the world. All right. So there's a pattern that's happening. There's something significant about the age of 30, you know. All right. So yeah. All right. Good observation. All right. So now let's go back to verse 26. Well, read 24 one more time. 24 and 25. Somebody else.
Once again, I had to get up. Where I'm at, K. Houston? Quinnipo. And
Yeah,
and when
ahead.
they
I know how it is. I know you're on the granddad duty.
my Lord, thank you, bro.
I can read it.
They don't win in there and wait.
Come on,
A meeting.
give them a break.
Yeah, thank you, man.
Verse 24.
That Quinnipo.
Okay, thank you. And Nera lived 29 years and became the father of Terah. And Nera lived 119 years after he became the father of Terah, and he had other sons and daughters. And Terah lived 70 years and became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran.
Now, now, what do we see different?
His age, for one thing, he was 70.
Yeah, he was 70. Don't know the significance in that. We just see a difference. You know, prior to this, 32, 33, 31, 30, 29, and all of a sudden 70 years. All right, 70 years. I'll read verse 26 again.
And Terah lived 70 years and became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran.
All right, now let me go ahead and clarify what's happening from what we talked about last week. All right, well, read verse 27 and 28, then we can talk about it. Let me give us context.
Now these are the records of the generation of Terah. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran became the father of Lot. And Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his birth, in Ur of the Chaldeans.
All right, read verse 29.
And Abraham and Nahor took wives for themselves. The name of Abram's wife was Sarah, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Ascah.
All right, so what do we learn about, what do we see Abram and Nahor doing?
They were taking wives.
And what did we learn last week about the wives that they took?
Well, we knew Sarah was barren, I think, couldn't have any kids.
Sarah was barren. Who's and so Sarah's name is also what?
Ascah?
Ascah Ishka. All right. And what was Sarah's sister name?
This Milcah?
Milcah.
Milcah.
Milcah. All right. Now, what was the daughter's name of Abram's brother? The two daughters of Abram's brother that were highlighted in this story. Now, he may have had more daughters than these two, but these are the ones that were named. I'm not exactly sure if he had more daughters, but what we do see is the highlight of these two daughters. So what was the daughters of Abram's brother Haran name?
Haran. Her daughter, okay, with the Mecca and Iscah is how you said it?
Iscah, yeah.
Iscah. Right. Those was his daughters.
Those were his daughters. All right. So let's keep going back. We're working our way back. So Abram, it appears that Abram and Nahor took wives. It appears that what we've learned that Abram and Nahor married their brother's daughters. All right, in our culture, this is repulsive for a lot of reasons, but in their culture, if we see prior after this, we'll see Abram sends his servant to take a wife for his son Isaac, and he sends them back to the family of Nahor. We'll see that. So he sends them back to his brother's family to get a wife for his son. So this ain't an uncommon practice. We just didn't pay attention to what was happening. We see Isaac and Rebekah send Jacob back to Laban, who's the grandson of Nahor. All right. So we just don't pay attention. All right. It's about preservation of a promise in the genealogy and the legacy. We don't pay attention. So let's keep going back. Now let's go back to 26 so I can make the point. Somebody read verse 26 again.
And Terah lived 70 years and became the father of Abraham, Nahor, and Haran.
And what stands out to us? What's different?
Well, Terah's age is different.
Terah's age is different. He's 70. So do we think Terah broke the norm? We see prior to that in all the generations of Shem, the firstborn, the father had a son around the age of 30. Do we think he broke tradition and waited till he was 70 to have his firstborn? What do we see happening?
I don't think people are living as long as they were. Seems like their ages decrease.
Yeah, that's another thing. Kind of cut in half. We went from 400 years to 200 years and then to 100 and something years after the firstborn. All right, but let's talk through what's happening. Remember, we highlighted the fact that in God's story, in the writer's narrative, to honor a benevolent act done by someone in the genealogy, that person's name was mentioned first to honor them regardless of their age. That was one of the writer's rules, or unwritten rule for the writer to honor someone. They can change the order from eldest to youngest in order to honor something benevolent someone done. Or in their culture, it's called a mitzvah, or in the Jewish culture. So that's a benevolent act. So we see the character of individuals being honored by mentioning them first. And also, we see them being honored because in some ways they get the birthright placed on them, meaning the promise of the legacy. And what happens when you get the promise of the legacy is that everybody's role is to contribute to your legacy. Everybody's purpose for being on earth is to ensure that your legacy is fulfilled. All right, and so we see that. That's what the covenant of Jacob's desire for the birthright meant. He knew that. So whether he knew it to fulfill God's legacy or he just had it to be greedy, the birthright said that all the other children and distant relatives' purpose in life was for you to fulfill God's mission in your life. And all of the wealth of everybody else was your wealth. They contribute to your heritage. All right. So that's something we got to point out, because remember, we started out talking about what did Abraham give up, and one of the things he gave up was heritage. So let's cut to the chase. Abraham gave all that, was willing to give all that up to fulfill God's promise. He was willing to sacrifice all of that. He was a selfless person. We overlooked that fact. But because God told him to do it, he was like, hey, it means nothing. Somebody else can have it. So it had to fall to Nahor because Haran was already dead. So the only son left to receive all that was Nahor. Abraham was like, okay, he can have it because God told me to do something different. I'm giving it up. I'm willing to sacrifice it. All right. So there was always sacrifice involved with living out God's vision for our lives. I have always been. All right, let's keep thinking. Terah lived 70 years and became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. When a writer in their culture talked about the genealogy, remember he earlier he mentioned the firstborn, and he connected the age of the father with the firstborn. Here, slightly different thing is happening. Remember Ham, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Ham looked at his father's naked and was disgraced, and therefore in the genealogy his name was mentioned last, or the order of his name, because he was born first. And the birthright or the blessing was placed on Shem. So they began to change the order to honor the benevolent act Shem did and placed his name first in the genealogy, because his father bestowed the birthright or the blessing of the firstborn upon him. And so they mentioned Shem first, and they mentioned him to honor his benevolent act. And it gives credit. The idea of covering his father's nakedness was his. It gives credit that the idea of walking backwards as not to disgrace our father was his. And so they honor him by just in the order in which he was named in the genealogy. Something similar is happening to Abram. His father's given a vision to leave Ur of the Chaldeans to go to Canaan. In the midst of this journey, his son dies, Haran. And in the midst of that, he settles in a place called Haran, potentially to honor the death of the memory of his son. Whether he stayed there to honor and change the name, or whether he saw a place that was named the same, there was a connection. He didn't make it to Canaan. All right. However, in the midst of his son dying, we see Abram doing something that the Bible, we don't necessarily give him credit for, but the Bible highlights it in subtle ways. It's called discovery. It's hidden truth. And as we study cultural norms and practices, the hidden truth is the fact that Abram is being honored in a similar way Shem was being honored for a benevolent act. So now we have to read, and I've mentioned that to you 2 times in the Bible. The order of the names was changed in the genealogy early on. One for Shem and now for Abram. So what we have to do is figure out the benevolent act Abram did. So let's read verse 29.
And Abram and Nahor took wives for themselves. The name of Abram's wife was Sarah, and the name of neighbor's wife was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Ishka.
We see in that one statement or one verse 2 benevolent acts Abram takes. One is he leads his brother into honoring the dead sibling. The naming of Abram first highlights the fact that it was Abram's idea for both of them to take wives. And it was also Abram's idea of who wives or who they would marry. And Abram had the option to choose because it was his idea. The Bible gives him credit. In their culture, he's given credit because his name is mentioned first. All right. And so Abram takes Sarai, who is also Ishka. The second benevolent act is, okay, since this is my idea, Haran, I will not suffer you the loss of not having children if you do this. I tell you what, you take Milcah. Since Sarah is barren, I'll take her. Selfless. Because in this culture, your livelihood is dependent on your children. So because it's my idea, I'm not going to suffer you, Nahor, to not have to be fatherless for the rest of your life. I'll take that upon myself. I'll make that sacrifice, but we're going to honor our brother. And the way we're going to honor him is we're going to make sure his legacy lives on through his daughters. So therefore, we're going to marry his daughters. But in our culture, that's incest. And also, the first thing we think about is they're his nieces. That's child molestation, ain't it? That's the first thing we think. All right, let's eliminate the age. Let's look at the age of the daughters. Let's look at the age of Abram, most likely after Haran died. How can we figure this out? Scripture gives us everything we need to figure it out. It's about understanding the clues. So now we have to go back to verse 26 and look at his father Terah's age. Somebody read verse 26 again.
And Terah lived 70 years and became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran.
The benevolent act continues to honor Abram for deciding to allow the legacy of his dead brother Haran live on. To honor him, they allow in the narrative, in the genealogy, Abram's name to be mentioned first. So therefore, if Abram's name is mentioned first, his father's age has to be revealed through Abram's name, through Abram's birth. So his father was 70 years old when he gave birth to Abram, but not necessarily his firstborn. And so that means most likely Haran, who died, was probably born to Terah around Terah being 29 to 32. Let's just say for the sake of unity, he was 30 years old when he gave birth to Haran. And now he's 70, so that's 40 years later when Abram was born. So that means most likely Abram's brother Haran was 40 years older than Abram as well as Nahor. What does that mean also? We don't know the age of his daughters, but we do know that he was at least 40 years older than his son. So a lot of times, come on, John, you are muted.
Well, I was just going to refer what you're saying right now. We don't know when Haran had Sarah and Milcah. They could have been very close in age to Abram and Nahor.
Exactly. And that's not uncommon in our culture. It's for auntie and a niece to grow up, or uncle and a nephew to grow up around the same age. So most likely, evidence is pointing to that fact. And because they grew up around each other, they probably all agreed generationally, because again, their purpose was to honor the legacy of the father. And to do so, that was the best way they could honor the legacy of their dead brother in marriage. And Abram was given credit for it as a benevolent act. Therefore, the choosing of Abram was most likely because of the qualities God saw in him. Just like he identified Noah to be a man of walk upright and blameless, And he honored Noah to be the one who would build the ark. He saw qualities in Abram. He said, you know what, Abram? Your selflessness and your willing to sacrifice and the benevolence that you want to do to the sake of making sure someone else is better, I can use that. I can use that. And it's not the first time that it happened with Abram. So we see a great God quality in Abram. And we see God using Abram because of the qualities of character Abram possesses. And a lot of times this is not highlighted. Comments, questions, or thoughts?
So this give us the idea of the people who God is looking for, who He chooses. Shut up. You know, this give us, you know, because God is just not going around just choosing anybody.
Yeah.
It's a reason for your choice. It's a reason He chose you, Rabbi, to be this who you are. It was a reason because of something you saying that God seen in you.
Yeah.
And that God seen in me and everybody else on this call. You know. And I like that word like being unselfish, because one of the waste traits that you can have, a character you can have, is being selfish, want everything to go your way, you know. And to your point, we also be quiet. We also know that be quiet. We also know that Abraham, when it came to Lot, Abraham continued that same thing. He said, whatever land you want, you take it. And I'll take what you don't want. Okay, go in there. Okay.
That's another important fact about the selflessness of Abram. Even with that choice with Lot, it just shows his character continues to surface and he makes the same choices from the same reference point. So yeah, good stuff. Yeah, good stuff. Also, let me settle something else in our mind. So most likely, Haran was at least 40 years older than Abram. And when a female child turned 13, to 16, she was often given into marriage. And a lot of times, if we see in history, in this culture, the male was about 15 to 20 years older than the wife. All right. So this also kind of plays in the role of Haran's daughters, Milcah and Ishka. They were between the ages of 13 to 16 when Abram and Nahor took them as wives. And that means that Abram and Nahor was somewhere around 27 to 30 something years old. All right. So we just kind of see what's happening and the possibilities, or how it is a possibility. But we also kind of see God's story honoring Abram in a way we never knew. We never thought, because we casually read over it. We never paid attention to the qualities that Abram possessed, or the qualities God saw or affirmed in Abram as he chose Abram. And we see these over and over. So we want to pay attention to them. All right. Any other thoughts, comments, or questions? All right. Now let's get back to the original question. What did Abraham give up? All right. We see he gave up legacy. And we see how important it was, because what happened is his father, Terah, had placed the birthright on him. And that means Abram's purpose in life at that time was to further his father's legacy. But giving that up said a lot. He gave not so he did give up everything, because that was everything to someone in their call. My purpose is my father's purpose. Meaning my reason for living and all my efforts went towards building my father's wealth, building my father's, building into my father's vision, and it also meant tradition and heritage, and what else is included in the tradition and heritage of the father to the son. Anybody else can think of anything else included into the heritage and the traditions of the father to the son? What else is included in that?
Talking about the father wealth and everything.
Well, there's something else. There's another W word. Every father had wealth, and every father did something.
What? No, wait a minute.
Another W. Help us get to it with a hint.
Mm-hmm.
We don't pay attention, but we see it often that every father worshiped. Early on, before God made himself known through Abram, we see that they picked up idol worship. And that was something in the heritage of the father passed down. So by Abram leaving that, he left the way his father worshiped behind. The idols that he worshiped and sacrificed to in that heritage. He gave that up as well. So things was changing. And no wonder God is doing something different in Abram, because now Abram, so if you notice, every time something happened significant, Abram went back and built an altar to the Lord. That came from somewhere, right? To build those sacrifices and altars to the Lord. So God is establishing a whole lot through Abram that we necessarily don't pay attention to. But we also see Abram giving up more than we could reconcile in our minds. And he gave up the tradition, the way of life inside of that heritage. Even the way his father sacrificed to idols was something else he gave up. And that might have been a good thing. But he gave those things up. Thoughts, comments, or questions on that?
Selflessness has no limits.
No limits. No limits. All right. When else do we see Abram being the most selfless in his life? There's another moment in history we see after this. Can anybody recall?
When he gave up Ishmael and Hagar.
Come on. Come on. Let's read it. Read it. Let's go to Genesis chapter 22. Another part of his selflessness. He struggled in soul. God had to console him. Yeah, if we don't see these words from God, I don't think he gives in to Sarah's request. God had to console him.
So Abraham was selfless when he offered Isaac,
Yes.
and when he he offered to Lot to take whatever portion he wanted to take.
Yeah.
That's two. And then number three, would you say when he obeyed God to leave his country, kindred, and his father's house?
Yeah, but we were talking about when he chose the woman Sarah. See, that's the selflessness. Sarah, at the time could not have kids. And Abraham had to face charge. You see what I'm saying?
Keep going.
Okay, so I'm saying, since Abraham had to face child, he could have chose the woman that he knew that could have kids. But he said, I won't do that.
Oh, okay. All
Very
right.
unselfish.
Yeah.
Very unselfish.
Not knowing that God was gonna do a miraculous thing through Sarah at the time, all he knew is that, hey, my legacy is over. This choice seals legacy promise doomed in his life. He didn't know God was gonna, do something miraculous, but it was his selflessness that caused him to make that choice in the first place. So yeah.
Because later on in Abraham's life, Abraham had everything.
Yes.
And he asked God, said, I got everything, but I don't have no one to leave it to.
That's right.
And that's when the promise was made about Isaac.
Yes, yes. What's happening, Soup? How you doing?
Oh,
Good, good. How's everybody?
Doing good, doing good.
Yeah, just rolled back into town from Atlanta, so catching what I can.
All right, man. Safe travel, safe travel. All right. So yeah, so we see Abram's continued selflessness. All right, let's go back to. Hold on, I need to go back one. Or did I pass? Let's go back to 21, I think. Yep. Yep, this is where we at. Yep. So yeah. All right. So let's go back over those lists, Dr. Fred. Give us your list again.
Well, when Abraham offered Isaac,
All right.
and when Abraham gave Lot the option to choose the land that he wanted,
Yep.
and then we talked about Abraham's choice of Sarah.
Yep.
Now,
All right.
I'm not 100% clear, Pastor, on Abraham's choice of Sarah. Can you help me? He had a choice there.
Yes.
Who was his options?
Yeah, he had a choice between Milcah or Ishka. Remember, Ishka and Sarah are the same. Ishka is the Chaldean name or the way to say princess. Sarah is Hebrew, but the Hebrew language didn't exist at the time. So we got to attribute that to scribes trying to make the connection. All right, who wrote out the story. However, it appears that Milcah was the oldest. So most of the time, the oldest will be chosen first in marriage. However, because some way they knew Sarah was barren, Abram didn't want to place that on his brother Nahor. So in his selflessness, he chose Sarah and allowed Nahor to marry Milcah so Nahor would be able to have children. But his selflessness was like, hey, I'm going to marry Sarah and we'll deal with the barrenness of not having a child. Does that help?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much.
Yeah. All right. So a lot of selfless acts, a lot of benevolent acts done by Abram. Also, we're going to read here another benevolent act is his letting go of Hagar and Isaac. He didn't want to, but in selflessness, he honored the promise God made with him through Sarah to bear a child, and Sarah's wish to send Hagar and Ishmael away. But again, we're going to see God console him before he conceded. He wasn't willing to do it immediately. So let's read. Somebody start at verse 1 in chapter 21.
The Lord visit Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And
Pause one
Sarah,
moment.
go
Let
ahead.
me remind us of what's happening in chapter 20. Abram, remember, we see that happening. Abram and Lot splits up. You know, Abram, you know, and Lot's herdsmen are having a conflict, and you know, their possessions have grown, and you know, and then again, you got to think about it. Abram took Lot with him because he thought Lot was going to be the one to possess his birthright, was going to be the one who lives out his heritage. So a second time in his life, he gives up that opportunity by allowing Lot to depart from him. So his move and his sacrifice of telling Lot, hey, let's split up and you choose which land direction you want to go, was another selfless act, but it was also another thing that he gave up, because taking Lot with him was the way he would fulfill his legacy. All right, and live out his legacy through his nephew Lot. So for him to allow Lot to leave, that was giving up again. However, God visited him. The three men visited him. The angels visited him, and they came to him and they told Sarah and him that Sarah would bear a child. And remember, Sarah laughed and lied to God. And no, I didn't laugh. God was like, yeah, you did laugh. And basically, God promised that, hey, you know, this time next year, Sarah will bring birth to a child. So this is that next year we're reading about. And we see that promise God told him in that visit coming true. All right. And so this is where we are in verse 1. This is a year later from that promise. And now we see it coming true. So start at verse 1 one more time.
All right, verse 1. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time which God had spoken to him. Abram called the name of his son who was born to him, who Sarah bore him, Isaac. And Isaac was circumcised, his son Isaac, when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abram was a
Hebrew, Isaac.
Huh?
Yisik. In the Hebrew, they say Yisik.
Say it again.
In the Hebrew, they say Yisik.
Yisik.
Instead of I, they pronounce it Yisik. Yisak.
Isaac. Isaac. Okay. So, Isaac. Okay.
But we see the promise of God being fulfilled through the birth of Isaac. We see Abram and Sarah naming him Isaac. And we see the circumcision on the 8th day to fulfill the symbolic promise. Abraham fulfills his part of the covenant. God had fulfilled his part of the covenant through giving him Isaac. That was his first sign of the covenant being fulfilled. Now, to honor that, Abram circumcises Isaac to continue to fulfill his symbolic part of the covenant. All right. Like he said, as God had commanded him to. All right. So we see a few things happening. All right. So let's keep reading. Let's keep reading.
I'm sorry, I had to mute. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God made laughter for me. Everyone who hear will laugh over me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children, yet have borne a son in his old age? Yet I have borne a son. Yet, I'm going to say it again. Yet I have borne him a son in his old age.
Verse 8.
Verse 8. And the child grew and was weaned by Abraham, made a great feast on the day Esau was weaned. But Sarah saw that, okay,
Keep going.
stop.
Yep, there we go.
But Sarah saw that the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had bore Abraham, laughing. So she said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son. Wait a minute, HaYesod.
I know how you now y'all see why I keep my grandson out of here when I'm teaching, because that joker a fireball. He gonna point at everything.
Now you holler one more time. These people gonna say you get a whooping. All right, now sit up here. Where I'm at, HaYesod?
All right, we on verse 10.
Verse 10.
Uh-huh.
Okay. She said to Abraham, cast out the slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Esau. Okay. And the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account.
So that's the point I was making. So wasn't an easy choice for Abraham. He was distressed about it. He struggled with it. Right? Let's pay attention to what's about to happen. Read verse 11 again.
Okay. Oh, wait a minute. Oh man. I can't even get back. Okay. I'm base 11. Okay, verse 11. And the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on the account of his son. But God said to Abraham, be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah say to you, do as she tell you, for through Esau shall your offspring be named.
All right. So God had to intervene. God had to give him some assurance. And once again, we see Abram is a man who he obeys to understand. He never hesitated to obey the voice of God. So when God did, all he knew is it's obedience that's going to follow. And we see that he never once hesitated. That's that character quality. But also, that was another moment of sacrifice. So the next one we got to write down is his giving up of Isaac and sending Hagar away. Was another selfless act. You know, giving up of sending away.
What do you mean, the giving up of Ishmael?
No, well, Ishmael, I'm sorry, yeah, my bad.
Yeah, you said Isaac. Okay.
I said Isaac. The sending away of Hagar and giving up Ishmael. It's another selfless act. All right. But he did it in obedience to God's voice, and that's all it took. That's all it took. God said he's gonna obey. He'll figure out how to understand later. All right. All right. Somebody else pick up reading again. Somebody read verse 12 and 13. 12, 13, and 14.
But God said to Abraham, do not be distressed because of the lad and your maid. Whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her, for through Isaac your descendants shall be named. And on the son of the maid, and of the son of the maid, I will make a nation also, because he is your descendant. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar, putting them on her shoulder, and gave her the boy and sent her away. And she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. And the water, verse 15, and the water in the skins was used up, and she left the boy under one of the bushes. Stop there.
Let's keep going.
Then she went and sat down opposite him, about a bow shot away, for for she said, "Do not let me see the boy die." And she sat opposite him and lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the lad crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What is the matter with you, Hagar? Do not fear, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is. Arise, lift up the lad, and hold him by the hand, for I will make a great nation of him." Then God opened his eyes, and she saw a well of water, and she went and filled the skin with water and gave the lad a drink. And God was with the lad, and he grew, and he lived in the wilderness and became an archer. And he lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt.
All right. So, a couple of things happen. One is God had promised Abram that his children, the descendants, will be made into a great nation. However, Ishmael wasn't the child of promise. So he wasn't the child of promise who God would bless the rest of the nations through him. However, God still honored the promise by making him into a great nation. It just wasn't the nation that would be a blessing to all the nations of the earth. He wasn't the child of promise. All right. The other thing is, we see now and I won't get into this, but we see now the conflict in the Middle East about whose prominence from the descendants of Abraham, and we see part of that conflict in the Middle East still, struggling over this particular verse as well. The descendants of Ishmael, they challenge the descendants of Isaac. All right. But we see that constantly going on. All right. But there's something else happening here. I don't know if I'm gonna have time to point it out, but we just want to kind of think through what else do you guys see? Anybody else see anything standing out? Any comments, questions, or thoughts so far?
For that last part, I never knew that Hagar picked a wife for Ishmael, from Egypt. I never knew that.
Okay.
And I done read this account of the Bible many, many years, and I never knew that.
Yeah.
Right there in front of my eyes.
Yeah. Anything else? Good stuff. All right. We started this conversation about what does Abram give up by leaving his father's household. All right. For a father in this culture, regardless if it wasn't a fulfilled promise through the son God promised him and Sarah, it was still a big sacrifice for him to give up his son Ishmael. I think Ishmael was around 13 or 14 years old at the time. So Abram had lived around his son Ishmael for 13 years. That was a huge sacrifice. It was another benevolent sacrifice. It was a selfless sacrifice, but nonetheless, it was one he made. And so again, fast forward. In concept, we won't turn there. We see the story takes us to the point where God asks him to offer up Isaac, his only son of the promise, his only son of Sarah. All right. And we see Abram do this without hesitation, another selfless sacrifice. But we see in all of this his trusting God. But once again, these character qualities that we don't notice in Abram highlight something God saw in Abram which probably identifies God's choice of Abram, right? But we'll see some similar qualities in Jesus. Remember, the shadows of the Messiah are visible in these verses, meaning the attributes of Christ are always visible. And so we see selfless sacrifices over and over by Abram, which mirrors some selfless sacrifices of Christ. We just want to keep that in mind as we look at these stories. The shadows of Christ or Messiah are always visible through these stories. We want to keep that in mind. All right. So we see these things that Abram gives up, you know. We see Abram giving up his father's Badab, the birthright, you know, the heritage of his father. We see him giving up, you know, some relationship, you know, Haran, you know, Nahor, his brother and his family, they split at that time. He gives those relationships up. You know, things didn't happen that way. He gives up the heritage, tradition, you know, the customs of his father. And that means he has to build his own custom. But we see God shaping those things. And we see one of the customs that he adopts is the sacrifice. Every time God did something, he sacrificed to God. But God is building something, you know, and establishing something. This is another thing I thought about as well with Jewish believers. You know, they identified or separated themselves from the Gentile. And that was huge. You know, that's a big debate even now. You know, the Gentiles, you know, have a heritage in the family of God and all of those types of things, right? And the prominence of Jewish heritage, you know, in God's story. And they, you know, Jew and Gentile, you know, they separate themselves. However, Abram was a Gentile. Abram was a Gentile himself. You know, he was from the land of Ur, from the Chaldean. So, you know, I just think that's ironic, right? You know, but we see God creating a people group to make himself to the world. So we see the purpose. We see God's purpose. You know, he always had, you know, world vision, always. All right, any other thoughts and comments, reflections from you guys?
Well, I have a more better, I don't know what the word would be. I love for Abraham and everything he did. I mean, wow, man, like you say, we we have always been told that do and then understand, not understand and then do. Abraham just did exactly what God told him, you know, from Jump Street, you know, and without even saying, well, why this and nothing, he just did it, right? Uh, I have great respect for him. That's the word. I have much more respect for Abraham now than I ever have had in the past.
Yeah.
I see why they called him the father of faith. He earned that title.
Yeah, definitely. Any other takeaways from anybody else?
The selflessness of Abraham screams at me,
Yes.
period.
Yeah. 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 And that's our big takeaway today, right? Like digging out or uncovering that attribute in Abram that we probably didn't notice or see before. You know, right? Is how often Abram was selfless and sacrificed his whole future. Basically, the most prominent thing a person had was the legacy through children. He was willing to give that up over and over and over, you know, which is probably the biggest sacrifice a male could make in that particular time. Doesn't have the impact because of the way sonship and fatherhood is today. But in that culture, it was everything. So it speaks volumes. You know, we could relive and really have an idea of how, felt, prominence of what it meant in that culture. You know, we would have a better appreciation. All right. So yeah, the selflessness. Any other takeaways for today?